Good afternoon. It's always a pleasure to be here at the Medanta Institute um, in this refresher course. So this is a topic I'm sure most of you would have been bombarded with. What is an antifungal? What are the different classes of antifungals? This is a topic which is beaten to pulp in every city, town, whatever it is. So I'm trying to lessen the burden, information overload, and probably look at a syndromic approach to fungal infections. Look at which antifungal you apply in what infection. Look at biomarkers and their applicability for the rapid identification of fungal infections, and then a footnote on the new emerging problem of Candida auris. Why do we need to talk about fungal infections separately? Fungi generally produce disease only when the immune system of the host is compromised or the mucosal or integumental barriers are disrupted. While this may be an exception in the community, interruption of mucosal barriers and integuments is one of the main side effects of intensive care. Unlike bacterial cultures, fungal cultures do not have the sensitivity and specificity in some situations. Therefore, you need to look at several factors in their entirety and combination, like the risk factors, the predisposing factors, the culture reports, as well as the clinical correlation between these three things. Unlike bacteria, which are prokaryotes, fungi are eukaryotes. So, some of the metabolic pathways on which normal antimicrobial agents work also work on metabolic pathways of the host, that is a human, who is also a eukaryote. Therefore, antifungals are more toxic to the human body than antibacterial drugs. That is the reason why we need to be more judicious and cautious when we apply antifungal drugs. Fungi are the more prone groups of organisms which can form biofilms on a variety of indwelling devices. So, at any point of time, your infection control practices are breached. This biofilm can trigger a massive fungemia or an infective process. Let's look at who are the patients who are at risk. This is not rocket science. Those who are on renal replacement therapy, those who are requiring parenteral nutrition, those whose Apache 2 scores are higher, who have longer ventilatory days, those who have central venous and urinary catheters, prolonged ICU stay, broad spectrum antibiotics, major surgery. So essentially, the bread and butter critical care patient is a sitting duck for fungal infection. So that's the reason why we should know about it. In addition to it, each fungal species has got multiple, genus has got multiple species attached to it. Like there are 18 species of Candida which have been documented to cause invasive disease in humans. There are 8 species of Aspergillus which are documented to have caused disease in humans. So the vast spectrum of pathogens is something that baffles the microbiologist as well as the treating intensivist. Because of their facultative nature, is much difficult to grow fungi. Therefore, the culture results take longer time for you to act on. That's the reason why probably we believe or we trust empirical therapy more than culture-driven definitive therapy, and that's probably the reason why resistance to some of the commonly used antifungals is becoming commoner and commoner. In the community, you don't have control over the use of steroids, so any joint pain, any viral infection, anything that resembles asthma is treated by steroids by the peripheral centers. So concomitant steroid is something you cannot wish away. Candida auris has emerged as a big headache in the intensive care units since the last 8 or 9 years. So we'll look at it in the end of the talk. And then biomarkers, which have been rapidly amalgamated into several antimicrobial stewardship programs, have also made their way into the diagnosis and management of patients with fungal infections. So those are the contributing factors. From an Indian perspective, from in a general non-retroviral disease population, the top four contenders or isolates of fungal infections are the most common Candida albicans and Candida auris. Okay, and you have the Aspergillus species, the cryptococcal organisms, and the mucorales. So, in order of frequency, if you look at Indian data, these are the top four contenders of fungal isolates in the intensive care unit, and I'm going to focus entirely on these four groups of organisms. Candidiasis, we very well know, invasive candidiasis. As I said in the beginning of the talk, anybody who is critically ill comes into the intensive care with a high Apache score, requiring a central line and broad spectrum antibiotics, might require renal replacement therapy, and broad spectrum antibiotic is a high risk candidate for candidal invasive disease. In addition, those patients who have received steroids, and especially those who have had surgical intervention for a gastrointestinal perforation below the ligament of Treitz, are very high risk candidates for invasive candidial disease. So, Candida per se, invasive candidiasis can produce several syndromes. One is sepsis and septic shock, that is candidemia. You grow the candida in the blood, you know the diagnosis. Cutaneous manifestations like acute disseminated candidiasis can result in cutaneous manifestations very similar to Stevens-Johnson syndrome. You can get endovascular syndrome of endocarditis and infection of implantable cardiac devices, and with increasing use of ECMO, colonization of the ECMO cannulae and therefore seeding of the tricuspid valve with candida is being increasingly reported for patients with ARDS who have been treated with ECMO for greater than a week. Those patients who have undergone knee replacement surgery in suboptimal environments are prone for candida osteomyelitis and candida arthritis. Endophthalmitis is a known manifestation of invasive candidiasis. There are a simmering group of patients who have a chronic disseminated candidiasis, who have hepatosplenic candidiasis. So these are all the clinical syndromes which you can encounter with invasive candidial disease in the intensive care unit. So you can have a colonization or a candida colonization index which takes into account all the risk factors which we mentioned. I will show you all the scoring systems which we have for candida probability. Blood culture seems to be still the gold standard against which all diagnostic tests are measured, but that gold standard still yields only 50% sensitivity. So that's the problem with diagnosis of candida. The biomarker, the beta-D-glucan, is a pan-fungal marker with a sensitivity and specificity of about 80% for invasive candidiasis. The more recent molecular absorption technique with time of flight called MALDI-TOF that can give you the resistance pattern in as quick as half an hour, but you need a positive growth on culture. You need to feed that positive culture onto the MALDI-TOF for you to get the resistance pattern. The fluorescent in situ hybridization is again performed directly on positive blood culture. So while you get quick information from these two entities per se, they are dependent on a positive culture which is going to take 5 to 6 days. So that's the problem with using either MALDI-TOF or the PNFish, and that's where the biomarkers come into picture. So the PCR based assays, we use the magnetic resonance techniques, the traffic light PCR, basically to differentiate between Candida albicans and Candida glabrata, not other species of Candida. So if you want to treat candidial infection empirically, the first for candidemia, especially invasive candidial disease, given the resistance to azoles, echinocandins are the drugs of choice at this point of time. So they are cidal drugs, and therefore they should be the preferred drugs for critically ill patients who had previous azole exposure. Recent data seems to show improved survival with echinocandins even when compared to patients who were azole naive and the organism was azole susceptible. The problem with echinocandins is it penetrates very poorly into the CNS and urine. So if you have really a candida urinary tract infection that is documented, echinocandins are not the drugs to be used. Azoles, fluconazole, voriconazole are static drugs for candida. They are not cidal drugs. So we may not be able to get much fungal clearance with azoles alone. Fluconazole may be used in less severely ill patients who had never been exposed to azoles in the past, but that's very rare in the current context of intensive care. Amphotericin B is an option, alternative to echinocandins in resource limited settings. The fear of renal failure should not deter us from using echinocandins if economic factors preclude or prevent the use of echinocandins for patients with invasive candidial disease. When you have invasive candidial disease, the duration of treatment is 14 days of effective antifungal therapy following the first negative blood culture and the resolution of illness. Several adjuvant treatments are recommended, but none better than source control. If you have an infected prosthesis or a device, you better get rid of it. In metastatic infections, like somebody has got valvular infection disseminated to the eye, you need to look at both the eye as well as the heart. These are all the scoring systems which have been used to triage patients with suspected candidial disease. There are about 8 of them, all focus on the risk factors which we have looked at, but the one that includes the routine bacteria, the ICU scenario is the SHORE criteria, which looks at temperature, sensorium, admission from other healthcare, hospitalization in the last month, mechanical ventilation, and nosocomial bacterial infection. So the common factors which all of us encounter when we admit patients into ICU are covered by the SHORE criteria, but the more well-validated, well-accepted, published data is the Ostrowski-Zeitner as well as the Lyon criteria, and they use the other parameters of diabetes, broad-spectrum antibiotic, RRT, Apache score, and longer duration of ventilation. So basically this is using all the known risk factors, putting them into a scoring system and identifying who is at risk for probable candidemia. When you look at aspergillosis, the second most commonly reported fungal infection in Indian scenario. Prolonged neutropenia, not necessarily from chemotherapy or malignancy, but neutropenia of any cause is a risk factor for aspergillosis. Prolonged steroids and T-cell immunosuppressants, solid organ transplants, liver transplants are increasing exponentially in the country. So these patients are at a high risk of aspergillus infection. And there are emerging risk factors, COPD, cirrhosis, and mechanical ventilation. It's now suspected that several good number of patients who were previously labeled as infective exacerbations of COPD are actually patients who had invasive aspergillus disease, and that's come about with the availability of biomarkers. So you have several syndromes of aspergillosis. Pulmonary aspergillosis is the most common, most well accepted. Rhinocerebral or acute rhinosinusitis is a common manifestation which we often ignore in the intensive care unit, especially if you had nasogastric tubes for more than 2 weeks. Tracheobronchitis in patients who are lung transplant recipients and the immunocompromised disease. Cerebral aspergillosis in the diabetic population. Osteomyelitis in patients who had open trauma with multiple antibiotic exposure. Cutaneous aspergillosis and disseminated aspergillosis. So from cancer databases and the cancer surveillance and cancer quality of care groups, we have certain criteria to diagnose aspergillosis. The most well accepted criteria is called the URTC-MSG criteria, where they take radiological features of dense consolidation, nodules surrounded by area of low attenuation called the halo sign or the air crescent sign, plus a serum aspergillus galactomannan, which has a sensitivity of about 70% in neutropenic patients, but it is very low in non-neutropenic patients. So it may not be very sensitive, but if it's positive, its specificity is close to 85%. But if you can do a bronchoalveolar lavage and subject the lavage fluid to a galactomannan assay, the sensitivity is more than 70% in all the groups, including those patients who have received prophylaxis with an azole. So if you can do a bowel and send the bowel fluid for a galactomannan assay, your chances of identifying an Aspergillus disease is much higher. The drug of choice is voriconazole. Alternatively, you could use amphotericin B. Echinocandins are not sidal for Aspergillus and hence not primary therapy, but they may have a role in a salvage therapy if there is intolerance to amphotericin, or if prior voriconazole prophylaxis has been given, you could use echinocandins. Combination of voriconazole with an echinocandin is used commonly in patients at high risk of poor outcome, but there is no data to say that a combination is better than a single drug alone. Unlike 2 weeks of therapy for candidial invasive disease, the duration of treatment for any of these syndromes of Aspergillus is more than 3 months, that is 12 weeks at least. So this is the EORTC MSG criteria for labeling somebody as Aspergillus disease. The proven invasive pulmonary aspergillosis is a positive culture obtained from a sterile site, that is a bowel, or a positive culture from an unsterile site along with histopathological evidence of Aspergillus in the histopathology specimen. So you can do a kidney biopsy, you can do a lung biopsy, and show that there were invasive elements of Aspergillus in the histopathology specimen. Then the culture plus this will give you a proven invasive aspergillosis diagnosis. Probable aspergillosis is a positive non-cultured based test like a biomarker in a susceptible host with compatible radiological features. And possible presence of compatible clinical and radiological features, no microbiological proof. So you tend to treat 100% of these patients, but maybe you should be treating probable IPA for benefit of doubt for the patient. Those of you who are appearing for the IDCC exit exams might see this picture in your OSCE stations. This is the crescent sign, fungal ball of a CT on a CT with the air shadow called the crescent sign. Pathognomonic hallmark, one of the diagnostic radiological criteria for invasive pulmonary aspergillosis. The third fungus which we come across in intensive care practice is from an Indian database is HIV cryptococcal infection, most commonly reported in HIV patients, but renal and liver transplant patients are also included in this list. Emerging risk factors for cryptococcosis are chronic liver disease, tuberculosis, SLE, and end-stage kidney disease without renal transplant. So somebody who's been on maintenance hemodialysis or on CAPD are again candidates for cryptococcal infection. So cryptococcus can produce chronic meningitis or cerebral cryptococcoma. You could get pulmonary cryptococcal infection. You can also get ophthalmitis like candida. You can get prostatitis, which is nearly impossible to eradicate. So all these are the very commonly reported clinical syndromes in immunocompromised patients as far as cryptococcus is concerned. So the diagnosis of cryptococcosis in the CNS is established by lymphocytic pleocytosis with high protein, low to normal glucose on the CSF. The India EAT preparation, which we routinely ask, has a sensitivity of only 80% in non-AIDS patients. But the biggest population in whom we do it is the HIV patient, in whom the sensitivity falls to 50%. If you look at the CSF cryptococcal antigen, the sensitivity goes up to 95% if the titer is more than 1:1000. So that is the titer where we should be labeling them as definite cryptococcal infection. CSF culture is less sensitive and the serum cryptococcal antigen is not as sensitive as the CSF antigen for sensitivity and specificity. Treatment of cryptococcal infection has induction phase and a consolidation phase. The induction phase previously was considered to mandatorily include 2 drugs. Current evidence seems to suggest that you don't need that, results are as good, but as of now we still say there is a combination of ampho-B plus flucytosine or fluconazole, followed by a consolidation phase of 8 weeks with fluconazole and a maintenance of more than 6 months with fluconazole. The duration of treatment for cryptococcosis is close to a year. And for CNS disease, you need to have therapeutic CSF drainage required during induction to lower the raised intracranial pressure if there has been cryptococcoma. This is the cryptococcoma, so you can compare it with tuberculoma. These are more periventricular, larger in size, usually single in every hemisphere, unlike tuberculomas which are in multiple areas, and usually will have a teardrop morphology. These are the classical radiological pictures of a cryptococcoma in the brain. The last fungal infection most commonly seen in Indian population is mucormycosis. Most of you would have seen this. Clinical syndromes happen in patients with poorly controlled diabetes, so you get the dreaded rhinocerebral mucormycosis. You can also get it in hematological malignancies, penetrating abdominal trauma and burns patients. Those who have received dysperioxamine therapy, IV drug users, the malnourished, and you can also get outbreaks in the hospital if there has been one index and contaminated dressings, more so in burns units where sterility sometimes is compromised. The diagnosis of mucormycosis is by direct microscopy. Culture is very difficult to isolate mucor. Histopathologically, you need to differentiate mucor from other molds, and you also need to document angioinvasion. So if you get a tissue, the intima of the vessel should show invasion with mucormycosis to call it invasive mucor. The radiological feature suggestive of pulmonary mucormycosis is more than 10 nodular infiltrates and an effusion and a reverse halo sign. I will show you what the reverse halo sign is. The drug of choice for mucor is polyenes, that is amphotericin B. Alternatively, we can use posaconazole, but as of now, the IDSA says this is only a salvage therapy. It's not the first line therapy. It requires 7 to 8 days to achieve therapeutic concentration, and the absorption is maximized when taken with high fat food. There are several adjuvants which have been used like Disperiox and hyperbaric oxygen, gamma interferon, but none of them have improved the outcomes. The duration of treatment is until near normalization of radiographic imaging, negative biopsy specimens and cultures from the affected site, and the immunosuppression should have reversed. This is the reverse halo sign. When you say halo sign, that means there is a dense consolidation surrounded by a ground glass opacity. That is the halo sign which we saw in aspergillosis. The reverse halo sign happens in mucor, where you have a central ground glass opacity surrounded by an area of dense consolidation. This is the CT scan hallmark of pulmonary mucormycosis. So if you look at the diagnostic methods, traditional methods like culture can detect all the pathogens, but the replication time is longer, negative results are higher, and it does not differentiate colonization versus infection. So that's the problem with culture. Histopathology will always diagnose in all organisms, but it cannot confirm identification, and it needs an invasive specimen which may not always be possible in a critically ill patient. Radiologically, it detects most of the classical signs which we discussed, but it can only suggest differential diagnosis, and radiology can be absolutely normal in the immunosuppressed patients. So because some of those radiological signs are intrinsically related to cell-mediated immunity. So if somebody is immunosuppressed, they may not manifest the classical radiological signs of fungal infection. The rapid diagnostic tools, galactomannan is only for Aspergillus, but it can be falsely elevated if your patient has received piperacillin tazobactam. There is some concern even cefoperazone sulbactam is cross-reacting in the last 72 hours before the sample has been drawn. It has a low sensitivity in solid organ transplant recipients, and we don't know the cutoff values yet for galactomannan. The beta-glucan can be used to identify most species of Candida except Parasilosis and Aspergillus, but it's false positive in patients who have recently undergone dialysis because of cross-reactivity with the dialysis membrane protein. Somebody who's got packs in his abdomen can have a false positive beta-D-glucan assay. So that's something. And somebody who's received albumin infusion can again cross-react with the beta-D-glucan assay. So be careful when you send the sample. It's an expensive test, so think twice before you send it to the lab. Fungal PCR is organism specific, but fantastic tool, but it's very early days to bring it into routine intensive care practice across the country. PNA FISH, as I said, can detect, differentiate traffic light PCR. A fish can tell you between whether it's albicans or glabrata, but it usually overlooks the other species. When you look at breakpoints of antifungals versus Candida, there are several choices available for Candida. So what is the cutoff for each? When do you say it is sensitive and when do you say the drug is resistant? So fluconazole, the MIC is less than 8. So if it is more than 64, it is resistant. Between 16 to 32, you have to use between 2 times to 4 times the normal recommended dose of fluconazole. So for itraconazole, it is less than 0.12, voriconazole less than 1, amphobi less than 1, and all the echinocandins is less than 2. So this is the breakpoint concentrations of all the antifungals which are available for the use against Candida albicans. So as I said about the galactomannan, about the biomarkers, the galactomannan can detect all these species, but it misses Candida and Saccharomyces. The beta-2-glucan misses Cryptococcus, Blastomyces, Rhizopus and Mucor, and can also miss Parasilosis. The Candida mannan will also miss Parasilosis, can differentiate Tropicalis, Glabrata and albicans. The recommended threshold for a positive result of the beta-D-glucan is an optical density index of 0.5 or higher. Overall sensitivity is about 71%, fairly good specificity. The beta-D-glucan also has a very high specificity for PCP. So if you suspect somebody to be having fungal infection as well as PCP, you can't use beta-D-glucan as the tool to say this is only fungal infection. It could be pneumocystis infection as well. A little bit of Candida auris as emerging intensivist. You need to know about this threat in the ICU. It is an emerging fungus that presents a serious global health threat. And after United States, India is the highest reported incidence of auris, and that is with our reporting system. So if you have more robust reporting system, you know where we are. And the reason why this is important is that it is often multi-drug resistant, meaning that it is resistant to multiple antifungal drugs commonly used to treat Candida infection. And it is difficult to identify. The most important problem with auris is that your lab, if they are not aware that they are looking at an auris, they could report it as glabrata, they could report it as Parasilosis, they could report it as Tropicalis, where it's not so. If they don't know that this is also possible, they could misreport it. Misidentification will lead to inappropriate management, and you need PCR based techniques to identify auris at this point of time, except for the fact that other than the whitish colonies which albicans and tropicalis produce and the pink tinged colonies which auris produces, there is nothing to differentiate with current conventional microbiological techniques. And it has caused outbreaks in healthcare settings. The disaster it creates is as bad as a C. diff outbreak in your ICU. So it's as bad. If you know you're treating auris, then echinocandin is the drug of choice. And switching to a liposomal ampho-B could be considered if the patient is clinically unresponsive to echinocandin treatment or has had persistent fungemia for more than 5 days. So in summary, fungal infections are increasing in incidence. We know that there are several well-known risk factors. We know there are several scoring factors. We can use either one or more of them. Azoles and echinocandins, in whatever order you want, are the mainstay. Biomarkers might help us to discipline ourselves and restrict the use of antifungal agents.